everyone, and welcome to our Life of Jesus Bible study. I'm your host, Cynthia Blaze, the Director of Women's Ministries of La Jolla Presbyterian Church. This year, we are going to read through all four Gospels as a continuous story together. We're going to try to keep in mind the original intention of each writer, but also see how we draw closer to the person of Jesus by reading them as a whole. We're going to see if we can piece together a timeline also for the 3 years Jesus ministers on earth and find where the pieces of each Gospel fit into that timeline. My prayer is that we will all grow in our understanding of the message of Jesus, grow closer to him personally, and therefore be better able to share that message of love with those around us. I invite you to listen into this recording of our Wednesday morning Bible study and be encouraged. Hi, ladies. Good morning. How is everyone? Do you all have a good Easter? Oh, hello, Beth. Beth, the resident ER doctor who saved me. I still might bring her over for you to look inside of her ear. But I have an otoscope. My husband has one. When I picked up Stella from school on Monday, she was like, my ear hurts. And I was kind of like, sorry, girl, I'll get in the car because we got to go to baseball because my son had a baseball game. And right now, like, baseball rules everything. So we got in the car and we went to baseball, and she was like so mad and angry because I guess, when you're in pain, and this child reacts like anger to everything. Like that's her go-to, like we all have our go-tos. Her go-to is anger. She is mad that it hurts, and she's going to tell us all, and she's going to be mean to all of us. And so when I finally got Axel settled in baseball, I was thinking about taking her to the doctor, but before I took her to the doctor, I texted Beth, our resident ER doctor, and I was like, Beth, what do I do? So apparently it's only Advil at first, right? And then at 3 days, you can take them to the doctor if their ear's still hurting. So, because then they would be sure it's progressed to the level of infection. So isn't this good to have this around? So I texted her. I was like, could you just look in her ear and tell me what it is? Because Beth lives close to me. And she's like, I don't have an otoscope. Well, that night at home, my husband goes, we have an otoscope. I was like, why do we have an otoscope? Like, it just would make sense if you all knew my husband, because he's amazing. And I kind of like to joke that he's a doomsday professional. Like, if the world were to fall apart, you would probably want to come to my house, because I think there's probably a bunker under my house that even I don't know about, because he is so prepared for everything. He's amazing. So, So my husband, who works in finances and is not a doctor, owns an otoscope. So it's amazing. Okay, we have a lot we are going to dive into today. I just realized. Ooh, can I reach? Can you hand me that? Perfect.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The whole thing. I'll take both. Thank you. Forgot to grab one of these. We have a lot we're going to cover today. I am slightly worried that it may be a little ambitious, and so we will see how we do, and hopefully we will get through it all, and if not, well, we'll see how we do. So let me start us off with prayer, and then we will dive into where we are today. Jesus, thank you for this. Thank you for this morning. Thank you for this time we have to stop and to focus on your word, and I thank you for... Thank you that you have given us your word, that we can study it. I pray that you will pour out your spirit into this room right now. I pray that you will give us all wisdom and insight into your word. I pray that you will direct our conversation. I pray that you will direct me as I teach, that I only teach what is true. And I pray that your presence will rest here with us, and that we will be drawn closer to you in your heart through this time in your word. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. So we are, as you ladies know, we have been studying the life of Jesus, and we have been looking at it from 4 different perspectives, right? Reading through all 4 Gospels at the same time. I hope you ladies have been enjoying it. I have learned so much, I feel, this year, just getting sort of the big picture of looking how the different Gospels represent the stories of Jesus. So, and I feel like I'm getting the Gospel writers more too, like just more insight into Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and who they were. And I hope I've been loving it. So today as we start, we are going to be looking at the events of the night after the Last Supper. So what happens after the Last Supper leading up until the final trial. So we're not going to go into the crucifixion today. Next week is going to be crucifixion. Following week is going to be resurrection. And the last week then is going to be the last 40 days of Jesus. So we are nearing the end. But so tonight what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the events from Gethsemane through, it's actually like 5 trials, 5 different people that he goes before, all trying to condemn him. And it's interesting to walk through it. So I had a lot of fun putting this together this week because it's like a puzzle. I had some great resources and guides I was using, but it's fun to see how the events of the night progress. And this should hopefully help you ladies do that. So today, again, where are we in the life of Jesus? We are at Thursday night of Passion Week. And beginning this week was Saturday night, Jesus is anointed by Mary of Bethany. Sunday, he enters Jerusalem with all the great fanfare. We know that he rides in purposely looking like the Messiah, right? Riding in on that young colt full of a donkey. And people react as if he is the Messiah with this huge rejoicing. And we know, though, that who are the people that are reacting? It's not the Jewish leaders. Who's rejoicing? It's the crowds, everyday people. And we get this dichotomy, right, between the Jewish leadership and the crowds, with the crowds loving Jesus, longing for the Messiah to come and bring them freedom from Rome, and the Jewish leaders just wanting to hold on to status quo. I've said, I feel like they have the at least we have mentality. At least we have our city of Jerusalem. At least we have our temple. Let's not hope for the impossible. Let's just hold on to what we have. But also, the Jewish leaders have been very offended by Jesus because all of his teachings were really condemning them, the way they did religion, their lifestyle, telling them that they did religion just for show, that their hearts were not in it. I mean, that's pretty big condemnations for the Jewish leadership, that they neglected what God cared most about: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And so there's this momentum that's been building, a plot that's been set in motion, and the word is out that the Jewish leaders want to arrest Jesus. But they can't. Why can't they? Because the crowds love him, and he's so popular. And so Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, he's hanging out in the temple courts, and he's teaching, but they cannot arrest him because all the people are around. And if they did, what would likely happen? They would riot, exactly. So they cannot arrest Jesus during the daytime. So and at first, so Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, Monday and Tuesday, these different envoys of Jewish leaders, remember, they come to him and they're trying to get him to say something what? Blasphemous, exactly, because they want to have him say something that's going to offend the crowds and have the crowds begin to turn against him. But he's too clever. And remember, instead, the reaction of the crowds is they're amazed at his teaching. They hang on every word that he says. And even the Jewish leaders begin to respond positively, which is amazing. Some of them say, well said, teacher, and they stop asking him questions. We learned that 2 weeks ago that many of the religious leaders even actually believed that Jesus was the Messiah. But the Pharisees had said that anyone who would believe Jesus was the Messiah, what would happen to them? They would be put out of the synagogue. Exactly. So we see, I think, what we don't see, I think, as modern readers, is the amount of control that the Jewish leaders had over the people of Israel at this time. And what is their control really based on? We talked about this last week. Fear, exactly. They are controlling the Jewish people with fear. John comments that the Jewish leaders loved human praise more than praise from God. Exactly. And last week we focused on what Jesus taught his disciples during the Last Supper. The most profound bit to me was realizing what Jesus said meant when he said that he was giving them a new command. That, remember how we said that if Jesus is giving a new command, there also had to be an old command, right? And so what was the old command that was given, or commands? The 10 Commandments, exactly. So these commandments were given by Moses on Mount Sinai really to establish two things. If you think about the Ten Commandments, I know we talked about this before, but the Ten Commandments are kind of divided up into how we relate to God and how we relate to each other. Exactly. So that's the basis of Ten Commandments, how we relate to God, how we relate to each other. And but those commandments bound the Jewish people together as a community. It was supposed to set them apart as a Jewish community. And then they had the sign of circumcision, which was further setting them apart. So the Ten Commandments were supposed to create this different group of people, that they would look different than the people around them. And so when Jesus is saying he's giving a new commandment, he's saying that he's also creating a new what? Do you remember? A new community. I heard that. Yeah, exactly. And that this community is based on what? Do you remember? Love. Exactly. Jesus says, I have loved you, so you must also love. So the example of how to love is the example of Jesus. And what kind of love is that? Unconditional. And how did we see him? What was that? No judgment. Sacrificial, exactly. We saw him washing his disciples' feet, humble, exactly. So that's the kind of love he's wanting them to have. And he's saying that he's creating a new community that's going to look different than the community around him. That we as Christians should look different because of how we love each other. And that should be the sign of what makes us different. How our churches treat people, how our churches treat the communities around us. That should be the sign that we are different, which I think a lot of us would say that's not necessarily how churches are known. But it's so neat to see that that is what Jesus intended for us. So it's a community of love set apart from the world around them by the way they treat each other. And then that starts with us. That starts with how we treat each other, how we treat the women in this room, the women in our churches, the people in our community. That's how it starts with us. So today we're going to pick up the story after the Last Supper. We are going to look at Jesus' prayer in the Gethsemane a little bit and his arrest there. And we're going to follow the events of the night. 5 out of 6 trials he actually goes through. We're going to see Peter denying Jesus, Judas hanging himself. So it's kind of a somber lesson that's ahead of us. Last week, though, I actually want to revisit. I really want to. I realized that I didn't really cover the institution of the Last Supper last week. And I think the reason I didn't do it is because I feel like that's something that maybe we have all heard a lot and been taught a lot. And I really wanted to focus on what was Jesus teaching in the upper room. That was my focus last week. But I realized I feel like I really missed a piece of Jesus's message, though, and wanted to revisit it just for a moment. And it's the idea of covenant. So, okay, this is a big review for those of you who are in this class last year. Do you remember what were the 3 P's of the Old Covenant? Anybody remember them? Well, what did I hear? Promise. Progeny. Place. Exactly. Place. The land of Canaan would be theirs as an everlasting location, everlasting place for them to reside. Progeny, that Abraham would have more children than the stars in the sky. And then promise that somehow through the descendant of Abraham, which would then go through the line of Judah, which would then go through the line of David, that there would be someone who would come who would create a sense of that the whole world will be blessed through this person. So that's this greater promise of this greater person to come. So those were the pieces of the Old Covenant. So that's what God would give the Israelites if they kept the covenant. So they had to keep the covenant. And if they did, they would have place, progeny, promise. Okay. But what did they have to do to keep up their end of the covenant? What did they have to do? That is actually a question. So what were the things that they were supposed to do to keep their end of the covenant? Keep the law. Exactly. And what was the law? The 10 Commandments. Exactly. So Exodus 34, 27 through 28. Then the Lord said to Moses, write down these words, for in accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights without eating bread or drinking water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. So the words of the covenant were the 10 Commandments. Now, we just talked about how these commandments set the nation of Israel apart from the nations surrounding it, right? This was the Old Covenant. And it was a covenant of faithfulness to God alone. And for their part, the Israelites, for their act of faithfulness, they had to continually bring animal sacrifices to the temple on a regular basis, right? And that over and over, the priests would shed the blood of these animals as a means of transferring sin, right? So the sin is transferred from people to these animals. The sin of the person was transferred to the animal was killed instead of the person. So, but the prophet Jeremiah says that there's going to be a new covenant that's going to come. So that's all the old covenant. 10 commandments, animal sacrifices, transferring sin, your sin to the animal. Okay, Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 31:34, listen to this. Listen to the terms of the new covenant that's going to come. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with their people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I'll put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. So in the new covenant, the law is not written on stone, but written where? In our hearts and in our minds. And will God be far away? No, because he says they will all know me, right? From the least of these to the greatest. And why are they going to be able to know God? Because what is he going to do? Right, but in these words, in this text, he says that he's going to forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. Exactly. So that's why the people are going to, that's why we can be close to God. That's the new covenant, is that he will forgive their sins, remember them no more. So in Luke 22:19 through 20, which was part of last week, and he said, this is the institution of the Lord's Supper, and Jesus, it says, and he took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this is the cup of the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. So when Jesus is saying this is the new covenant, he's referring back to Jeremiah. His body would be broken, his blood shed to seal the new covenant. So there's not going to be any animal sacrifices that are going to seal this new covenant. It's going to be his body broken, his blood shed that seals this new covenant. And this covenant is a new relationship with God where everyone can know God because of his forgiveness. And that God's laws are now going to be written on our hearts. So, and that this covenant created a new community as well. And this community would be known by love. So we also, didn't go through the, so anyway, I really wanted to go through that for a minute because I feel like I really missed that last week. We also didn't go through Jesus's upper room prayer last week, and I put part of that in your handouts today. It's the very beginning portion of your handout on the right-hand side, where it says Jesus prays for his disciples and believers. So I just wanted to read a little tiny bit of that today because I thought that was really good. How it talks about how Jesus prays for the disciples, but also prays for us who believe in Jesus through the disciples' message. So just the highlighted portion is what I'm going to read. So this is Jesus praying, and he says, my prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, in I and them and you and me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them, even as you have loved me. So Jesus' prayer for believers is that they would be what? Verse 21. They would be one, exactly. This oneness is interesting because it's the same as the Son and the Father. The Son and the Father are not the same person, right? They are two of three parts of the Trinity. Each part of the Trinity has a different role. And I think that's the same thing with us, right? We know Jesus talks about how we all are different parts of the body. We all have different roles, different strengths, and different gifts. But the body functions as a whole, as one, right? A healthy body works together. So I think that's the sense that he's talking about, is that he's praying for the unity of believers. Not that we're all going to be the same, but that we're going to experience oneness. And only in the way that really I think Jesus can give to us. And then if believers are one, what will this show? Verse 23. What is it going to show if believers are one? What was that? That Jesus is in them, right? And it proves, it says, that God sent Jesus. So unity will be the sign that Jesus was sent by God, that he is God. That's going to be the sign. And unity among different people, love for each other among very different people, these are things that only really happen in Jesus, right? I mean, I feel like we see a world divided around us all the time. But this is the result of the new covenant, is this ability to have unity among very different people, love among very different people. That is only something the Holy Spirit can really give. So I thought it was important to go through those two bits that I feel like I kind of missed last week. So now we're going to follow the events after the Last Supper. We're going to walk through Jesus's journey from leaving dinner through his first 5 trials, through meeting Herod. It's going to be a lot. We'll see how we do. So Luke tells us that Jesus goes, as usual, to the Mount of Olives. And Matthew and Mark says that he goes to a garden there called Gethsemane, which is on the Mount of Olives. Let's read the Matthew version. So I'm going to read Matthew 26, 36 through 46. So this is just going to begin setting our stage for the rest of the events. So Matthew. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him. Who are the 2 sons of Zebedee? Do you remember? James and John. Exactly. So he takes James and John and began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little further, he fell on his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked. He asked Peter, "Watch and pray, so you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping, because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away one more time and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping or resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." So Matthew so Jesus takes Peter and James and John, and we see this time of really anguished prayer with Jesus, but also surrender. We see, I think, also the humanness of the disciples. It's got to be late at night by this time. An exact hour is not given, but they've already had dinner. They've already had some wine. You know, it's probably sometime between like 10 p.m. and midnight. They are tired. And so we see the sort of humanness of them. Luke says they are also exhausted from sorrow. You know, Jesus has been saying that he's going away, and they're like, "Where are you going? Why can't we come?" And he keeps telling them, "I'm going to leave you." So, and we also, I think, you know, it's interesting, we see the humanness of Jesus too, don't we, in this moment, where he doesn't really want to go through what he knows awaits him. But I was just curious, how is Jesus' prayer an example to us? What do you think? It's okay to ask? Totally. To accept ultimately the word of God, to accept his will. Absolutely. I think that's exactly what it is. It's those twin things, you know. It's this vulnerability and humanness that God desires from us of seeking him in prayer, that really just pouring out our hearts and our spirit to him. But then this ultimate surrender, what he has for us, his will for us. All 4 Gospels report from here, with Jesus away from the crowds. This is the moment where the Jewish leaders are going to come and arrest him. Let's read both the Matthew and John versions, Matthew 26, 47 through 56, and John 18, 1 through 11. You can flip your pages. So starting with Matthew. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived with him. It was a large crowd, armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Then the man stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in place," Jesus said to him. "For all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way?" In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, "Am I leading a rebellion, that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this is all taking place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. It's interesting, Mark, written from the perspective of Peter, plus Matthew and plus Luke, do not mention who takes out their sword and cuts off his ear. John is going to throw Peter under the bus. Because remember, Mark wrote first. Matthew and Luke followed Mark because they had access to him. But John decides to mention Peter. John also brings in some other interesting things too. So when he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They're all carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you, I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so the words he had spoken will be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" All right, so Matthew says a large crowd comes. Now, but notice, who sent them in verse 47? Who sends the crowd? The chief priests and the elders. And that's really important to realize. It is the chief priests and the elders. The chief priests were the Sadducees. The elders were likely the Pharisees. John affirms this, saying that the detachment of soldiers and some officials came from who? Verse 3 from John. Chief priests and the Pharisees. Exactly. So now we know that we've got the leaders, the Sadducees and the Pharisees are here to arrest Jesus. John says that Judas knew the location because Jesus often met there with his disciples. What do the soldiers and officials come armed with? Verse 47 in Matthew and 3 in John. Swords and clubs. What else? Torches, lanterns, weapons. So, they come as a mob, right? They're going to arrest him. It seems like they're expecting a fight. It's kind of like game on. Like, we're going to take this guy down. So, and Peter, who I love so much, is just not going to go quietly, Isn't he just such a relatable person? I just love Peter. Peter, who jumps out of the boat to walk on water, who says that he will never deny Jesus, who says he will die for him. He's got his sword and he's ready to fight. He's going down. And so what does he do? Cut someone's ear off. Good job, Peter. I love it. Yeah, I love that John even names him Malchus, just to make sure you all know who it was. So, and it's interesting because even if we just sort of step back and look at it, these are the kind of details that show us that the writer of John was an eyewitness, that he was there. He remembers who cut off the ear. He remembers whose ear was cut off. So these are the kind of details that scholars notice when they're looking for authentic authorship. So, and then what does Jesus do to the servant? Heals him immediately, right? And then Jesus says, put away your sword, Peter. We're not going to have a fight here. And then I love this. He says he can call on the Father on what will be at his disposal. Matthew verse 53. Legions of angels. I like that. He's like, I can take you all down if you want to, if you want me to, if I want to. Like, I love that. He's like, I don't need you to fight for me, Peter. I can call in legions of angels and I'll be good. But why does he need to go through it, according to verse 54? Fulfill the scriptures. So the scriptures would be fulfilled. So the big picture of scripture being fulfilled is that this Messiah would create a new covenant, a new relationship with God. I actually meant to bring a handout that I could bring next time, but I have a great just PDF that shows pretty much how all of these Old Testament prophecies are all fulfilled in Jesus. And it's neat just to see that connection. So I'll bring that next time. So a battalion of soldiers, Sadducees and Pharisees have all come to arrest Jesus. But now what are they going to do with him? Where do they go? So the first stop, what I'm calling trial number 1 in your handouts, is Annas. Okay, so who the heck is Annas? Well, he's known as Annas, son of Seth. He was the high priest that was appointed by Rome. Note, appointed by Rome. This is important. So after Rome took over Judea in 6 AD, so just a little review here. Herod the Great died in 4 BC, split his kingdom between his 3 remaining sons and Herod's sister. So Herod Antipas, so now that Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, Herod Antipas gets Galilee and Perea. Philip gets the territories north and east of the Jordan. And then Archelaus gets Judea, including Jerusalem. Archelaus lasts only 9 years. And in 6 AD, Rome kicks him out and takes his portion to govern personally. So apparently he did not rule well, Archelaus. So they decide to put a Roman governor over Judea instead. So they don't give Judea to like Herod Antipas. They just put a Roman governor over that portion. So the Roman governor Quirinius is the first person who's put over him and put over Judea. Quirinius should sound a little bit familiar to us because he was the the guy who did the 2 censuses. The census likely when when Mary and Joseph go to Bethlehem. And also he does another census in 6 AD, which, as we've kind of mentioned here before, begins some riots because that's when the whole Judas of Galilee guy is telling people, don't pay taxes, and starts burning barns and cattle if they do. So there's this big rebellion in Galilee at that time. But Quirinius is the one who appoints Annas as high priest in 6 AD. Now, Annas only officially serves for 10 years, but remains a top political and social influencer from then on. He gets his son-in-law Caiaphas and 5 of his sons to be high priests for a considerable time. I just thought this was interesting, so I gave you a little handout, which you can pull out, this one. Okay, so this lists the high priests of what they call the Herodian Roman Empire. Now, if you'll see, the first highlight is Annas ben Seth. So it means Annas, son of Seth. He's 6 to 15 AD. Now, if you look down, look at all the other Ben Annases, also highlighted. So when it says Eleazar ben Annas, that means Eleazar, son of Annas. That's what Ben means in Hebrew, son of. And so you can see then there's Joseph ben Caiaphas, is the son-in-law of Annas, the high priest. Then you can see how they continue to go down up until even Annas ben Annas in 63 AD. He's actually there when the whole Jewish-Roman wars begin. And he actually sides with Rome, telling the Jewish people not to rebel against Rome. And so they kill him. So that's how Annas ben Annas is going to go down. But they're like... Not the Romans, the Jewish people kill him. They're like, we're done with you. But I just thought that was so interesting to see the amount of power and political influence that Annas is going to carry really through a considerable amount of time. Now, also remember when, remember at the beginning of Luke, when Luke dates the arrival of John the Baptist, he says it happens during the priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. That's the words, that's the phrase in Luke that's used. Happens during the priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. So what happens within the priesthood of Caiaphas, which is 18 to 36 AD, but it's known as the time of Annas and Caiaphas. Isn't that interesting? So that's why it's called the time of Annas and Caiaphas, because this guy, Annas, is a huge, huge political influencer. So it really just shows the level of political power that Annas held by that this time of the priesthood is called the time of Annas and Caiaphas. So when Jesus is arrested, it's interesting. His first stop is not Caiaphas, it's Annas. So that's interesting. That's where they take him first. So I'm going to read from John 18, starting in verse 12. So this is what we're calling trial 1. So then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. Then we skip a few verses because it kind of goes back and forth to what's going on with Peter. Down to verse 19. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. Then Jesus said this. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me? Okay, now this is interesting. So notice how the people in this even refer, what do they even refer to Annas? What do they even call Annas in verse 22? The high priest. So they even refer to Annas. John refers to Annas as the high priest. Now we know it isn't actually Annas that he's speaking to. I mean, it isn't actually Caiaphas, who is our high priest at this time, because in the passage directly following this, in verse 24, if you flip, next page, it says, then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So we really see the level of political sway that Annas held. He's even called the high priest. So verse 24, right, says that Annas bound him, sent him to Caiaphas. So Annas questions Jesus about his teachings, his disciples, sends him off to Caiaphas. All right, so what happens when Jesus gets to Caiaphas? So that's going to be what we're calling trial number 2. So I'm going to pick that up in Matthew 26, starting in verse 27. You can see, just though by a glance, that all 4 Gospels all talk about Jesus then going to Caiaphas. All right, Matthew. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, for the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they did not find any. The many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, this is Caiaphas. When it says high priest here, we're now talking about Caiaphas. Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. You have said so, Jesus replied. But I say to all of you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look now, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death, they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you? So it's in the middle of the night, but they've taken Jesus to the home of Caiaphas in Jerusalem. You have maps of Jerusalem that you're welcome to pull out and look at. So Peter follows from a distance, but he actually goes right up into the courtyard of the palace of Caiaphas. It seems at this point that many of the Pharisees and the Sadducees are present, but it's not an official meeting of the Sanhedrin. That's not going to happen to daybreak. So that's going to be the next trial. But the Pharisees and Sadducees question him, and again, what is their goal? Why are they questioning him? To get him to say something blasphemous. Exactly. They're going to look for some charge to bring against him that will make Pilate crucify him. Because the Jewish people were not allowed to impose the death penalty on any of their criminals. Only Rome could do that. So the Jewish rulers, they didn't like what Jesus was teaching, But they needed to find a charge that they could present to Rome and say, you need to kill him because of this. They asked Jesus, are you the Son of God, the Messiah? What does Jesus say in verse 64? It says exactly. And then Mark 14:64 actually says the exact same thing, says he is. So not only is he the Messiah, he says he's also going to be reigning with the Father. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. And that's a phrase that the Jews would have actually known or been familiar with. Does anyone, this is going to be a big, I'll be very excited. I'll be very impressed if any of you get this one right. Does anyone remember where we have seen that phrase before in the Old Testament? Son of Man. It's big trivia. It's all right. I would not have gotten it. Don't worry. It's what Daniel calls the Messiah in his vision. When Daniel has a vision of who the Messiah will be. Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 to 14 reads, in my vision at night I looked, and before me was one like the Son of Man coming from the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days, was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So Jesus is calling himself the Son of Man, right? That would be blasphemy to the Jewish leaders because he is calling himself this Messiah. I just think it's really neat to see those connections. This is what Daniel calls the Messiah. So Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, as that Messiah. So this is a problem because the Jewish leaders, they don't want anyone calling themselves God. And remember, they're looking for a political Messiah. They're not looking for someone who's going to come and claim to be God. But unfortunately, calling yourself God's son is still not worthy of death in Roman minds, which is going to be the problem that we're going to see. But the Jewish leaders beat Jesus. They wait until morning. And then this is where the story of Peter is going to get inserted, of him denying Jesus 3 times. So I'm going to read the which one am I reading, Mark or John? I'm going to read it's funny. I have 2. I'm going to read the John version. Okay, so we're going to read John 18, starting in verse 15. So Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You aren't one of this man's disciples, too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Then we go back to the trial of Jesus. So a couple verses later, meanwhile, Simon Peter was standing there warming himself. So they asked him, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? He's like, didn't you cut off my relative's ear? Again, Peter denied it. At that moment, a rooster began to crow. All right, so 3 different people come up to him and say, weren't you with Jesus? Aren't you one of his disciples? In Matthew, the girl says, come on, you have an accent from Galilee. You have to be one of his disciples. So she calls him out on his accent. Peter denies all 3 accusations, and as soon as he does, a rooster crows. Now, Mark specifically notes that the rooster crows what time? Look at verse 72 in Mark. Right, a second time. So I was curious about this specific mentioning of the second time the rooster crows. So I learned from some Bible dictionaries that roosters generally crowed 2 times during the night. The first crowing was usually around midnight. The second crowing was usually sometime just before daybreak. So sometime, they said, even around 3 or 4 in the morning. The second crowing was the time that laborers would get summoned to work. It was kind of like the wake-up call. So Jesus ends a parable in Mark 13:35 with, this is just thinking through timing. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning. So crowing of the rooster being different than the morning. Those are 4 times. Evening, midnight, crowing of the rooster, morning. So the main crowing of the rooster was after midnight, but before morning. So I'm not sure it's much more significant than kind of knowing the time that everything is occurring, but I think it's kind of interesting to sort of track through the events of the night. But it's interesting, too, how specifically Jesus pinpoints when Peter will do his third denial. It says right before the rooster is going to crow for the second time, which is going to be right before morning. It's interesting just to understand our basic timeline and really how early all of this is occurring. You know, that the arrest takes place really late Thursday night. These trials are going on all night or early morning on Friday. Annas and Caiaphas are being pulled out of their beds, to question Jesus. An angry crowd of Sadducees and Pharisees are accompanying him through all these different locations. Peter and another disciple have followed Jesus through it all, and the rest have deserted him. It's also interesting, who is this disciple? John is the only one who mentions that there was another disciple that was with Peter. Most scholars believe it was likely John, since he never names himself in his own gospel. He always calls himself by other things. He'll say the disciple whom Jesus loved, or he has these various names for himself, but he doesn't name him, but he never calls himself by name. So that's why most people think it was likely John who was there. Also, since we know that John is at the cross, we think he probably likely was following Jesus too. But that's interesting. So most likely John and Peter were the ones who were following Jesus through all of this. So after Peter realizes what he has done, the text says that he leaves the courtyard of the high priest and he weeps bitterly. So at daybreak, an official meeting of the Sanhedrin will be called. This is trial number 3. They all decide to bind him and lead him off to Pilate. Matthew says that Judas is seized with remorse and even tries to return the money he was given. In his grief, he can think of no other response but to kill himself. So, okay, now before we read about Jesus before Pilate, I thought it would be interesting to look at what do we know historically about Pilate. So Pilate is Pontius Pilate. He is the 5th governor of the Roman province of Judea. So after it's taken away from the family of Herod, after it's taken away from Archelaus, and there's now governors ruling, he's the 5th of them. He rules from either AD 26 or 27 to 36 or 37. He's mentioned by other early historians like Josephus, Tacitus, and Philo of Alexandria. All early 1st century historians also mention him. He's deposed in 36 AD after harshly suppressing a Samaritan movement. Pilate normally resided in Caesarea, which is the capital of Judea, the Roman capital of Judea, but came to Jerusalem on special occasions, especially if there could be times of unrest, both being true of Passover, because of the huge influx of all the pilgrims that would have been there at this time. Josephus reports Pilate repeatedly causes near insurrections among the Jews by being insensitive to their Jewish customs. An early historian Philo records Emperor Tiberius even reprimands Pilate for his insensitivity. Referring to Pilate's governance, Philo further describes this is in quotes, his corruption, his acts of insolence, his rapine, his habit of insulting people, his cruelty, his continual murders of people untried and uncondemned, and his never-ending and gratuitous and most grievous inhumanity. So that was 1st century historian Philo. Yeah, very popular. Good guy, this guy. Where's my last page? There we go. Sorry. All right, so let's read this account of Jesus before Pilate. So I'm going to read from both John and from Luke. So John 18, starting in verse 28 through 32, and Luke 23, 1 through 7. All right, so we are now on our last page of this handout. Okay. John 18. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, they did not enter the palace, because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." But we have no right to execute anyone, they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Then in Luke, then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate and began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be a Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." But they insisted, "He stirs up all the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here." On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was in Jerusalem at that time. All right, so why won't the Jewish leaders enter Pilate's palace? What does it say? They want to remain clean. Exactly. So Passover would be beginning that evening. So right now we're at very early Friday morning. Passover would be beginning at sundown on Friday. So, and entering the home of a Gentile would have made them unclean. So they do not want to be unclean because they want to be able to celebrate Passover. Pilate would have resided in the Praetorian, which was built on part of the old residence of Herod the Great. It shared a courtyard with Herod Antipas's home. You can pull out your handout. So there's these two residences were actually only steps away from each other. You can actually see them if you flip your, not the general Jerusalem map, flip it to the backside. You'll see both of them cited on that little map, and also a rendition of what the buildings most likely would have looked like at that time, which is interesting. The Praetorian was the official headquarters, the seat of judgment, the command center. And it's interesting, I think, that how close those two buildings are to each other. That's why Pilate's going to be like, well, Herod's here, send him over there, which is literally just across the courtyard. So if we enter into the scene, what does Pilate want to know in verse 29? What is he asking? What does he want to know? What's the charge? Exactly. What has this guy Jesus done wrong? So, and in Luke, what reasons do the Jewish leaders give in verse 2? What do they say? They don't pay taxes. Not right. Opposing taxes, subverting the nation. So now opposing taxes is a kind of a big deal because remember, that should remind us, Judas of Galilee, 6 AD, led that rebellion where they were like, burning cattle and not letting people register. So that was a really big deal. That was a big rebellion that happened. So this is kind of like, how there's sort of like words that people might say that might sort of get a little bit of alarm. Like if right now, if you want to get a little bit of alarm in a local school, you just use the word bully because we don't want to have any bullies. Nobody's being bullied. My child is not a bully and he is not being bullied. That's like one of those big words. So that's the kind of what they're doing. They're saying, and he's saying, don't pay taxes. Like this is going to be one of those big phrases that would be like, ooh, that's a big word. That means business. So that's what they're doing. They're saying, they're trying to use words that are going to make Pilate go, oh, okay. Like, yeah, kill him. So in John, it's funny, they can't even come up with a reason, right? In what John reports, he says, if he weren't guilty, we wouldn't give him to you. There's not even like a reason given. They also tell Pilate he claims to be the king of the Jews. The Jewish leaders are hoping that this claim to kingship is going to be enough for Pilate to say, sure, kill him. Pilate says, take him away, judge him by your own law. But what's the problem? What are the Jews not allowed to do? Exactly, they're not allowed to execute. So Pilate is going to have an interesting conversation with Jesus, which we will cover next time, where he starts asking him about truth. What is truth? So we'll get to that next time. Luke reports that Pilate tries to extricate himself from the situation when he finds out that Jesus is from where? Galilee, exactly. Now, if Jesus is from Galilee, he is under Herod's jurisdiction. And Pilate is like, hey, Herod is here for Passover. Let's just send Jesus there. So, but before we look at Herod's encounter, and wrap up for today, let's just remind ourselves, who was Herod Antipas? So he's son of Herod the Great, ruler of Galilee and Perea. Remember, he's the one who executed John the Baptist, right? Because John the Baptist condemned first his affair, then divorce, then remarriage. Remember all that? So that's how John got himself killed. He was a massive builder. He built the city of Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, where he had his palace named it after Tiberius, who was the Caesar at that time. He had this huge temple project. He augmented the second temple massively. So we actually know a lot about him historically. When I was on Wikipedia, I mean, there's pages on Herod Antipas. So it's really interesting talking about how he interacted with people. So, but what's very important about him is that he is not from the line of Judah. So the Jewish people don't view him as an official king. He's not the right king. But he appeased them by doing this massive building project. So he's tolerated since the building project was started by his father, Herod the Great, but he continues it under his rule. So Herod is thrilled to meet Jesus. Let's see how this encounter goes. So Luke 23, 1 through 12. No, that's not correct. Luke 22, starting in verse 8. So when Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. So the text says that Herod had been wanting to see Jesus for a long time. What does Herod hope Jesus will do? A miracle. Some kind of great sign. So what does that show you about the way Herod views Jesus? A sideshow. Totally, yes. Maybe like a magician or a wonder worker, right? Notice, though, who stands up to accuse Jesus? Who is still following him around accusing him? Who is it? The chief priests and the teachers of the law. Chief priests meaning Sadducees, because all the Sadducees were the chief priests. Teachers of the law meaning Pharisees. So, in any part of today, have we seen the Jewish common people involved? No. So this really shows us this dichotomy between the Jewish leaders and the Jewish commoners. The Jewish commoners loved him. They thought he was amazing. They did want him to be a political king, but these Jewish leaders are the ones that are scared of him. So they're the ones that are following him around, accusing him before Pilate, accusing him before Herod. So the Herod and his soldiers ridicule Jesus, mock him, dress him in an elegant robe, and send him back to where? Pilate. And it seems really that Herod can't find anything wrong with Jesus either. So that's really where we're going to end for today in our scripture. Next time is when we'll pick up and see the rest of his conversation with Pilate and then walk through his crucifixion scene. But one thing I was kind of pondering on, which I'd love to hear a couple thoughts from you ladies, as I was going through everything, just the events this week, I think it's interesting to look at the difference between Judas and Peter. How does Judas respond to his failure? How does Peter respond to his failure? Peter repents. Judas hides. Hides, that's a great word. He doesn't ask for forgiveness. Yeah. Yes. So Judas never allows himself to because he kills himself, right? And then Peter, what were you saying, Maya?
He made the choice to end his life.
Judas made the choice to end his life.
And then Peter, I just love Peter.
I know, I love Peter too. He's just so human.
Yeah.
And on our last week, we will see this great moment of Jesus forgiving Peter. And it's just one of my favorite stories in Scripture, and we'll go through it, where he is going to meet him on the Sea of Galilee, and he's going to ask him 3 times, Peter, do you love me? And it's 3 times for those 3 rejections. And each time he's going to say, go feed my sheep, which is pretty much good, get to work. Like, let's go. And so Elizabeth.
Well, when you're finished.
Yeah.
Did the Roman leaders have an opportunity to read Daniel?
Would the Roman leaders have read Daniel?
Or any of the Old Testament books? Like Josephus
Right. So I do know that they had the Septuagint by then, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So it's possible a Roman leader could have read Daniel.
I'm just wondering, obviously they didn't pick up on any of the
No.
in the Old Testament.
The Roman leaders, I think, probably wouldn't really have cared less. I think they wanted their Pax Romana, they wanted their peace. They wanted every nation to be able to function and have its own religious gods, but it's still as long as there's this overarching peace. I think the reason that Pilate gets in trouble for not being sensitive to Jewish customs is really because the Romans want peace. And so they're like, why are you offending these Jewish people? Why are you creating uprising? Like, that's not in line with our goal of just overarching everlasting peace, which is what the Romans wanted. So yeah, there would have been access to reading the Old Testament in Greek at that point, but it's just conjecture. I just doubt it would have been studied beyond the Jewish leaders. Any other thoughts on sort of the difference between Judas and Peter? Because I think that's kind of an interesting comparison to think how are we like them in our responses to sin? Like Sandy.
Peter has always perplexed me because he's always out there and professing as well.
Peter's always out there.
Question.
Yeah.
And then for him to outwardly, even though Jesus said, someone is going to deny me 3 times, when he did it, I always wonder, what were you thinking? Why
Yeah.
did you do that?
What was Peter thinking?
Set out
He,
obviously to do that.
yeah.
We know we can be forgiven, but I always question his real love for Jesus
You question his real love for Jesus
because of the things he did.
because of how he messes up. What do the rest of you ladies think? Think he was afraid?
Well, I think at the time he's just trying to continue to see what's going to happen with Jesus.
Yeah.
So for him to stay alive,
Yeah.
to don't be arrested at the same time and not be able to follow him.
Yeah, Peter's just trying to stay alive too.
Trying to,
Yeah.
oh no, I'm not with them.
Right.
Just I don't think he thought he was denying Jesus at the
Right.
time, but he was, right? But
Right.
It was
I agree with you.
Jesus said, but at the same time, he was just trying
Yeah.
to
He was
he
scared.
wanted to continue to see what happened with Jesus.
Yeah.
He was going to.
I agree. I don't think he really realized he was denying Jesus when he was telling those people, oh, no, it's not me. Yeah, but I think he was really scared. He didn't want to be arrested too. But he loved Jesus and was concerned about him. What were you going to say?
Maybe he's confused.
He's confused.
He doesn't really know how he feels.
And doesn't know how he feels.
I don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's so much that's going on. I mean, I don't, Roman centurions, guards, like, that's a lot. That would be very, very scary. And yeah, he wants to stay alive. Like, it's without being there, I think it's hard. We don't want to judge him because we weren't there in his same shoes. But I think what I just love about Peter is we just see this very human person.
And like that God, spoiler alert, I've had times where I didn't say, hey, I'm Jesus' best
Totally.
friend. So
And do we do that? Yes,
I
totally.
so